Today we're going to do some watercolor techniques using the watercolor technique sheet as our guide. The first thing you'll do is you're going to mark off 12 sections in your sketchbook. My sketchbook's 9 by 12, so my sections are 3 inches apart. So there's 3 inches, 3 boxes going across and 4 going down. Yours probably the same, if not, just do it accordingly so you have 12 sections. I use tape sometimes to mark off my sections as well, just so that I have a nice clean guide, and I also use the tape to label. Whenever you use tape with watercolor paper, if you're going to remove the tape, make sure you take some of the adhesive off first. Then you can get a pen and using the technique sheet, just label each section. Just follow the technique sheet and just, write in the different techniques in each box, like that. Okay, and then you're going to begin with the first technique, which is wet on wet. A wet on wet application is you're going to wet the paper, and while it's still kind of puddling, you're going to add the wet paint right into it. So it's going to bleed and it's going to spread, and you're not going to have a lot of control over it, but it really makes some very beautiful washes, and you can do some very lovely things with it. You can paint flowers, leaves, landscapes, still lifes, and use this technique. You can also drop other colors in, like I'm doing the green here, and it just will bleed into the other color and just makes a really cool look. But if you want more control over your application, then you're going to do wet on dry. And you can make it as light as you want or as dark as you want, but you'll have more control over where the paint will go, because you don't have as much water and it's not going to bleed and spread around as much. The next one is called a flat wash. It is also a wet on dry application. You're applying paint and then you continue to apply paint. So this is the darkest, kind of richest color that you can get with watercolor. Again, it's still going to maintain somewhat of a transparent look, but it has a lot more opaqueness than the other applications. You're just adding more paint as you go down. You're kind of utilizing all your paint, and then you never add more water. With the next one, which is a gradient wash, you're going to add the wet paint to the dry surface, and then you never add more paint. You just keep adding more water. And what happens when you add more water to watercolor paint, it's going to get lighter and lighter and lighter. So you can get some really nice value changes. Again, you could use this to paint flowers, leaves, shapes, still lives, and you can get you utilize value by going from light to dark and dark to light. The next one is masking, and I'm just using masking tape, but you really could mask your paper out with anything. You can, you get with masking tape, you get a very crisp edge. A lot of times I'll use masking tape as a border on my watercolor paintings, just because it will kind of set a boundary for the watercolor paint, which tends to kind of be very free and loose. So the tape kind of serves as a block, and it just blocks out areas of the paper that you want to maintain white. And it's kind of cool to fool around. We call this like a hard edge painting, when you just kind of put tape down, then just, fool around with different kind of paint. You could do different colors, you could do one color, and it gives a very sharp edge when you pull off the tape later on. With the masking out, you want to wait for it to dry before you pull the tape off. This way you'll get a nice, the cleanest edge you could possibly get. And hopefully you won't rip your paper. Again, make sure you kind of remove some of the adhesive of the tape by putting some lint on it. I usually like brush it up against my jeans or my sweatshirt just to kind of take some of the adhesive off so that later when I take it off the paper, I won't rip my paper. And this one I just tried a couple of different colors. The next application is layering. You can layer watercolor, but you have to be careful. You really kind of have to know your color theory. The reason you want to know your color theory when you begin to layer is you want to be cautious about mixing your colors. So, for example, you don't want to mix necessarily like an opposite color on the color wheel, like a complement, like a green and a red, because you're going to get browns. So, if you are not that familiar with your color theory, you should be. But if you really want to play it safe, you should stick with warm colors next to warm colors and cool colors next to cool colors. But it's always a good idea to use your color wheel when you're layering colors with watercolor, because this way it kind of gives you an idea as to what might look good together and what to stay away from. So you can see here I'm just layering green and then I'm kind of layering a yellow on top, but I did dry the layer underneath first. The next layer that I apply is like a blue-green on top of the yellow, and it's a little dark, so some of the yellow might not come through. So that's another thing you want to consider. Like if the layer on top is darker, you're not going to see much of the layer underneath if that's lighter. So there's a lot of things that you can play around with when you begin to layer with watercolor. You can mix opposite colors once the underlayers are dry. So for example, in this little design that I did, after the underlayers were dry, I did start to experiment with some reds and oranges on top, and you'll see that. But again, it was kind of safe because I waited for them to dry underneath before I applied the other colors. So just be careful when you're layering. You could always try and see what happens, but a good idea is to make sure the layer underneath is dry first before you put another layer on top. And then you can really do a lot of things with it. I always like to use watercolor. It's very relaxing. Sometimes if I'm having an artist block, I'll just put some music on, take out my watercolor, and paint anything that comes to mind. It just be intuitive painting, nothing, not trying to really make anything, just to kind of break into a more creative environment. The next one is sponging in. You can sponge with anything. Could be paper towel, could be a tissue, could be a sponge, could be cellophane. Whatever the surface you're sponging in, you're basically applying the paint to the surface. Here I'm using toilet tissue, and then you're just kind of, sponging it onto the paper, and you get kind of this nice textured look. And then sponging out is opposite that. So basically you apply your color, and then you can use a tissue or a paper towel. I like to use a tissue, and you can kind of blot out the paint. I like to use this when I'm doing landscapes. I like to apply the color. The next application is called Crayon Resist, and you're basically going to be using a light colored crayon. I'm using white here. And once you draw a design with the white and apply the paint on top, it's going to resist wherever the crayon was because the water and the wax resist each other. My grandchildren like this because they call it the magic picture. So it's a fun thing to do. The next one is dry brush. So you kind of dry your brush up and you just apply some dry paint And basically it kind of has a scratchy look to it, and it's great for doing grass or beach grass if you're doing like a beach scene. And you also could use it to layer on top of other colors. The next application is splattering. So I turned it around to show you. If you splatter, you want to block off your other areas because it's very messy. And I'm just showing you this. You know, you should block off your areas of your paper that you don't want to have splatter. You should also block off your clothing because even though it's watercolor paint and it is water based, it could still stain your clothing. So you can either just kind of fling the paint, or you can take a heavier brush and tap it. I like to tap it. It gets a very little, kind of little speckling look. You can experiment with different colors when you splatter. You can use an old toothbrush where you apply the paint with the toothbrush and then you kind of fling the color with your finger. And that gives a really nice, very fine splattering look. So that might be something else that you might want to try with splattering. The splattering is a lot of fun. It is a little messy, but you can get some really interesting textural looks with splattering. Here I'm applying some red on top just to give it a little bit, make it pop a little bit. So you could even mix your colors with that as well. The last application is salt texture. And so what I'm doing with the salt texture, basically you're applying some paint. I like it to be wet in order to really achieve the texture look. And you use salt. I like to use sea salt because it's more grainy and it kind of makes a nice texture. And you can either leave it on and leave the texture, or later on when it's dry, you can brush it off and it'll kind of leave these little speckled dots. And then here I am pulling off the masking tape from my masking area. Ripped a little bit over there, a little bit seeped through, but that's okay. And that's it.